Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to solar energy, as the government extended the domestic procurement mandate for the solar equipment to include the wafers and ingots. The second article is related to the opportunity to rebalance the World Trade Organization, as the 14th Ministerial Conference of the WTO is going to be held next week in Cameroon, Africa. Additionally, we'll be taking up 5 articles in the prelims pointer section which will be helpful for your prelims preparation. The first article is related to solar energy. Currently, we are witnessing a turmoil in the Middle East region, and it is going to have global repercussions because it is impacting the energy supplies. Because of the choke in the Strait of Hormuz, the global oil and gas prices are impacted. India also imports the oil and gas. Therefore, India's energy needs will also get affected. Hence, we want to become self-dependent in the energy sector. Therefore, in the foreseeable future, the significance of the renewable energy is going to increase for India. Therefore, the government extended the domestic sourcing mandate for the solar equipment to include now the wafers and ingots as well. Earlier, the domestic content requirement for the solar equipment included the solar photovoltaic cells. Therefore, we'll discuss the potential of solar energy in India, the need for solar energy, the advantages and the limitations of solar energy in India, and the government steps taken to promote the solar energy in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Infrastructure Energy. First, let's discuss a few facts regarding the potential of solar energy in India. Over India's landmass, about 5,000 trillion kilowatt hour per year of solar energy is incident. And as per the National Institute of Solar Energy, we have a potential to generate about 748 gigawatt of solar energy if just 3% of India's waste landmass is covered with solar photovoltaic cells. Similarly, the International Renewable Energy Agency's Renewable Capacity Statistics 2023 point out that India is fifth largest globally in the solar photovoltaic cells deployment, and the installed capacity in the solar energy as of January 2025 is about 100 gigawatts already, and the solar energy is contributing to about 47% of India's renewable energy generation. Therefore, it is contributing towards achieving India's goal of establishing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030, which is part of our Panchamrit goals. We also have the vision of achieving a net zero emissions target by 2070, again in line with the Panchamrit goals. Therefore, the share of the solar power, the share of the renewable energy in India's total energy mix has been increasing. The solar energy capacity has increased by more than 5 times over the past decade. The renewable energy installed capacity has increased by about 3 times over the past decade. Similarly, in India's electricity mix in 2010, the share of renewable energy was just about 16%, whereas in 2030 it is supposed to increase to about 50%. Now, where are we going to generate the solar energy? Where is the potential? The maximum potential we can see in the western part of India and southern India. For example, the renewable energy capacity in Rajasthan is followed by Gujarat and then Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Now, how is solar energy utilized? How is the solar radiation utilized to convert it into electricity? There are two ways of using solar energy. First is the indirect use. The indirect use means that we are concentrating the solar radiation using mirrors, etc., and concentrating that in the form of heat, and therefore that heat using that solar radiation is used to convert water into steam, and that steam is used to drive the steam turbines and thereby generating electricity. That is the indirect usage of the solar energy, using the solar radiation to generate electricity via steam, via the thermal usage. Another method is the direct use of the solar energy to convert the solar radiation into electricity. That is done by using the solar photovoltaic cells, by using the solar cells which are using the semiconductor materials. The solar radiation comprises of the lights of energy, the packets of light energy known as the photons or light quanta. The photons behave like zero mass particles, therefore moving at the speed of light, whereas the solar cells, they are comprised of the semiconductor material. When the photons strike the solar cells, they are either reflected or absorbed, or they are allowed to pass through. The photons which are absorbed by the semiconductor, it is giving its energy to the electrons in the semiconductor material, thereby enabling it to generate electricity directly. That is, the solar radiation is utilized to directly convert it into electricity through the solar photovoltaic cells. Now, what is the need for solar energy in India? India is going to become an energy hungry country because there is an immense demographic dividend at our disposal. We are a growing country, we are a developing economy, we need energy for infrastructure generation, for the establishment of industries, for production activities, for transport and logistics, etc. Therefore, we are going to be the third largest consumer of energy across the globe. As per the statistics of International Energy Agency, India's energy demand is going to exceed 50 exajoules by 2030, and by 2050 we will be needing about 73 exajoules of energy. Therefore, we will need to diversify our energy sources also. We cannot remain dependent upon the imports of oil and gas. Simultaneously, we cannot remain dependent upon the coal also. We have abundant supply of coal domestically, but we have greenhouse gas emissions targets that we need to fulfill. We have the climate change targets that we need to fulfill. Therefore, we need to move towards the net zero emission targets also. We need to be self-reliant in the energy production. Therefore, the investments in the renewable energy which are abundant in India because of the tropical location. India is a tropical country, therefore there is abundant supply of solar energy and the wind energy. Therefore, we'll be able to achieve our global commitments regarding the greenhouse gas emissions. And simultaneously, if we invest in the solar energy sector, it will lead to employment generation also, as about 3 million new jobs may be created by the solar energy sector by 2030 itself. And also, the solar energy is a good, viable, feasible alternative option to the off-grid areas. For the remote areas where the grid connectivity becomes difficult, the solar photovoltaic cells, the standalone solar energy grids can also be installed. Also, the investments in the solar energy can be empowering women as well. For example, you can quote the mini case studies like the solar engineers training the women for the installation, for the maintenance of the solar energy equipment through Barefoot College, Gramin Shakti in Bangladesh, Solar Sister in Africa. Similarly, in the Little Run of Kutch, the women salt farmers employed the solar pumps, which led to their incomes increasing by almost 90%. The We Care Solar in Uganda led to the usage of solar and subsequently reducing the prenatal deaths by almost 70%. The solar photovoltaic industry workforce in India comprises of almost 40% women, therefore providing them independence, economic independence as well as employment in the solar sector. Now, what are the advantages of the solar energy for India? First, it is a clean source of energy. Therefore, it will help India in achieving the health related goals, the sustainable development goals also. Secondly, it will help us in achieving the Panchamrit goals, which are to ensure that we have 500 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity by 2030. The share of the renewable energy is about 50% in our total energy mix by 2030. We are able to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. We are able to reduce the emissions intensity by 45% by 2030. And there is no fuel cost here. There is the initial capital investment in the form of the solar photovoltaic cells. After that, the solar energy is free and it can function as a standalone system also. It does not necessarily need grid connectivity, and there is modularity as well. Therefore, it is easy to construct in different sizes as per the demand of the quantity of energy, and there is ease of installation also and minimal maintenance which is required, because there is no wear and tear of the system, because there are no moving parts. Similarly, it has a long operation life also exceeding 25 years often. but there are certain limitations of the solar energy as well. For example, the initial capital expenditure, that is quite high. The solar photovoltaic cells, they are costly, and there is the intermittent nature of the availability of the solar energy. For example, it is dependent upon the relative position of the sun and the earth. Therefore, the sunlight intensity changes. The intensity is higher during the summer months. It is maximum during the mid-noon sun, and the angle of incidence also varies, because as the relative position of sun and earth changes across the day. And similarly, during the monsoon season, rainy season, the cloud cover also reduces the production of the solar energy. Plus, there is the problem of storage. Because of the intermittent nature of the availability of solar energy, the energy produced during the day has to be stored for its utilization in the winter months or during the night, etc. And the storage solutions are costly. For example, the lithium ion batteries, they are costly, and the other storage solutions are yet to be developed at an industrial scale. Similarly, the temperature of the solar photovoltaic cells impacts the generation of the solar energy, the electricity. As the temperature of the photovoltaic cell increases, its efficiency comes down. The solar photovoltaic cell efficiency in the conversion of the solar radiation to electricity is also quite low. It is just about 15 to 20%. And also, the manufacturing is concentrated in the downstream. The solar photovoltaic cells manufacturing, we are increasing our share, but the upstream segment, we have still not achieved a significant share. Therefore, the current domestic sourcing mandate regarding the manufacturing and the procurement of the wafers and ingots domestically, and the end of life management is also not proper. For example, what to do with the waste, the end of life cycle for the solar photovoltaic cells. Now, what are the government steps taken up to promote the solar energy sector in India? The government launched the comprehensive national solar mission, and we have the PM Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana. Under the Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, the rooftop solar installations are promoted. About 8 lakh have been installed, and the aim is to install 1 crore rooftop solar projects. And there is the production linked incentive scheme for the national program on high efficiency solar photovoltaic modules, so that the capacity for the domestic solar photovoltaic modules can be ramped up, and more the production, more the incentive given by the government to increase the volumes of production, therefore achieve ultimately the economy of scale in the solar photovoltaic cells production. There is a solar park scheme, under which the financial aid is given by the center to the states for the establishment of 50 solar parks having a capacity of more than 500 megawatt each, so that large scale solar parks can be developed by the states, hence the funds are given by the center. There is a PM Kusum scheme, through which the solar irrigation pumps are also promoted, incentivized for usage in the irrigation in the agriculture sector. India is also the pioneer of the International Solar Alliance. There are various viability gap funding schemes promoted by the government. There is the Canal Bank and Canal Top scheme, through which 100 megawatt of solar plant has been installed in Ramagundam on the top of the canal. There is the bundling scheme, through which there is the bundling of the solar power with the thermal power, so that the intermittency can be resolved. Whenever the availability of solar energy is not sufficient, then the thermal power substitutes for it, so that the grid is not overloaded. And there is the Atal Jyoti Yojana also, through which the street solar lamps are promoted. The other steps for the solar energy include the promotion of the FDI, the foreign direct investment, which will be 100% through the automatic route. And also there is a waiver of the interstate transmission system charges for the projects commissioned up to mid of 2025, so that there are no interstate transmission charges levied upon the renewable energy, the solar energy. Also, there is the mandatory declaration of the trajectory for the renewable purchase obligations by 2030. If we are able to achieve the renewable energy capacity of 500 gigawatt by 2030, then there must also be compulsory purchase of that. Therefore, the renewable purchase obligations upon the industries to purchase the energy generated through the renewable sources. Also, there are standards for the solar photovoltaic systems and devices, so that when we are ramping up the production, the domestic production of the solar photovoltaic cells, we can export them as well if these standards are in line with the global standards. Also, there are standard bidding guidelines so that the purchase of the renewable energy, the solar energy, is done through competitive tariff based bidding, and the power is usually bought by the distribution companies from the renewable energy generation companies from against the letter of credit or advance payments, so that there is timely payment of the credit, so that there is timely payment of the dues to the renewable energy generation companies. There is a green energy open access rules 2022 and the green term ahead market, so that there can be the sale of the renewable energy power through the energy exchanges as well. There is a previous year question also that UPSC asked in prelims 2014 regarding the technologies for solar power production and photovoltaics. Please try to solve it. Now, coming to the article, the requirement to use the domestically manufactured and domestically procured ingots and wafers, it will apply primarily to the government backed projects, utility scale projects, industrial projects, and to schemes such as the PM Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana. Till now, the domestic sourcing mandate largely covered the solar photovoltaic modules, whereas the components such as cells, the solar cells, wafers, ingots, polysilicon, they could be imported. But from June onwards, the solar cells will also need to be domestically manufactured, the solar cells used in the clean energy projects. The wafers, they are a critical part of the intermediate stage in the solar manufacturing value chain. First, the polysilicon is processed into ingots. The ingots are subsequently sliced into wafers. The wafers are used for the manufacturing of the solar cells. The solar cells are subsequently assembled into solar photovoltaic modules. Now, India has achieved significant progress in enhancing the solar module manufacturing capacity, the downstream part, but in the upstream segment we have faced challenges. The upstream segment of the solar manufacturing ecosystem faces challenges because of the capital intensive nature and the price pressures, the aggressive competition, aggressive pricing from China, and the existing PLI scheme although has covered both. For the solar photovoltaic modules, it covers both upstream, that is ingot, wafer manufacturing, polysilicon, and the downstream, that is solar cell and module manufacturing segments. Launched in 2021, the PLI scheme for solar photovoltaic modules aimed to install 65 gigawatt per annum of fully and partially integrated solar photovoltaic module manufacturing capacity. There is a mains practice question also. Discuss the potential and challenges of the solar energy in India. Additionally, evaluate the government initiatives to promote the solar energy in India. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the opportunity to rebalance the World Trade Organization, as the 14th Ministerial Conference of the WTO is going to be held in Cameroon, Africa. So we will discuss the governance structure of the World Trade Organization. Particularly, we will focus upon the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO, which this article also talks about. We'll observe what are the suggestions for improving the dispute settlement mechanism, what are the goals of WTO. This is important in GS2 under the topic important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure and mandate. First, let's observe the governance structure of the World Trade Organization. The WTO comprises of first the Ministerial Conference. The Ministerial Conference is the highest decision making body of the WTO. It meets every 2 years. All the members of the WTO are part of the Ministerial Conference, they participate in it. Then there is the General Council of the WTO. The General Council oversees the day-to-day operations of the World Trade Organization, and it is based in Geneva. The General Council itself acts as the trade policy review body, and it also functions as the dispute settlement body as well. It oversees three key councils, that is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, GATS, and the TRIPS Council as well. The trade related aspects of the intellectual property rights. Apart from that, regarding the dispute settlement mechanism, there is the dispute settlement body. The dispute settlement body is the function of the General Council itself, and then subsequently, if it is not able to solve the dispute, the independent panels are constituted, the independent expert panels, and then there is the appellate body also for the dispute settlement, and there are some specialized committees as well of the WTO. These specialized committees include the committees on agriculture, market access, anti-dumping, committee on subsidies, committee on safeguards, etc. Now, what are the goals of the World Trade Organization? Having an international trade disputes resolution body is important, especially for the developing nations which may not have the bargaining power. So it will lead to economic benefits, especially for the developing countries, as it will lead to the elimination, to the minimization of the trade barriers, the tariff barriers as well as the non-tariff barriers, the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, etc. And it will reduce the costs of the goods for the consumers, it will reduce the prices, it will increase the choice available for the consumers. As if one country establishes a huge base for the manufacturing capacity of a particular product, then they will be achieving the economy of scale in that product, therefore the prices of production of that product will come down, ultimately it will be benefiting the consumers also. Therefore having a WTO which can reduce the trade barriers can be beneficial for the consumers as well as for the developing nations. Also it will lead to better development and equity, because it can lead to economic growth. As the supply chains are developed more, then there will be economies of scale which will be achieved, ultimately contributing to the growth of both the source nations as well as the destination nations. And it will lead to the employment generation as well in the developing countries, because there the labor supply will be in the abundant, and the weaker nations, they will also get a voice, because else they might not have enough bargaining power against the developed nations if there is no international body like a WTO. Also it will help us in achieving the environmental and social goals as the global common as a whole, because there will be no disguised trade barriers if the WTO is putting in place certain rules for the principles for the international trade, and it balances the trade with the other priorities as well, that is the environmental priorities, ensuring that there is no environmental harm. The WTO also contributes in the maintaining of global stability, because through the dispute settlement mechanism, the peaceful resolution of disputes is attempted, therefore contributing to stability. And also it helps in tackling of the protectionism and uncertainty in the global trade, etc. Now let's trace the evolution of the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO. For that, let us first look at the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. The GATT introduced the Article 23, through which the disputes were attempted to be settled first bilaterally, and then decisions were to be taken by a consensus among the parties, among the disputing parties. If the consensus could not be achieved, then independent panels were established, expert panels, which will then be submitting a recommendation, a report. The reports of the expert panels will be binding upon both the disputing parties. But there were certain weaknesses in the system of the GATT, that is, there was the positive consensus rule. For example, first when the decisions were to be arrived through consensus, then even if one party voted against that, then it will not be followed. Therefore it gave a kind of a veto mechanism to the disputing party which was aggrieved, which did not agree with the decision taken. Therefore it was a weak mechanism for arriving at a consensus. Then there was the Uruguay round, which led to the birth of the dispute settlement unit. Through this, the key reforms were the negative consensus principle was adopted, that is, once the consensus is arrived, then it has to be followed unless all the members disagree from adopting it. And along with it, the strict timelines were adopted, that if there is a dispute, then within 1 year the expert panel has to give a ruling, and within 15 months it has to be decided if there is an appeal against the expert panel ruling. Also there was the constitution of an appellate body for the legal review of the ruling of the independent expert panel. Also there cannot be any unilateral blocking of the rulings, that is, the party which is not happy with the ruling, that cannot unilaterally block the implementation of that ruling. So what is the dispute settlement process under the WTO? Let us observe the process as well. First, it goes for the consultation mechanism. That is, first the consultation is promoted between the disputing parties. 60 days are given for the disputing parties to arrive through negotiation at an agreement. If there is no agreement through the consultation process, then there is the formation of a panel. The panel has to be formed within 45 days, and if the panel gives a ruling, then the losing party cannot block the implementation of the ruling of the expert panel. The panel report has to be submitted within 6 months to the dispute settlement body, and an appeal can be filed against the panel report also. This appeal can be filed in 60 to 90 days, and it is reviewed by the appellate body, a 7-member appellate body. And regarding its implementation and enforcement, a reasonable period is given to the parties for its compliance. If there is non-compliance by any of the parties, then the compensation negotiations are taken up in 20 days. That is, the party which is not complying, that has to compensate the other party. And if there are further non-compliance, then the trade sanctions can also be authorized by the dispute settlement body. That is, the party which is aggrieved because of the non-compliance, that can impose the retaliatory sanctions upon the party which is not complying. But there are certain challenges in this mechanism. First, there are sovereignty related concerns. Because the WTO panels, they have been reviewing the domestic laws, terming the domestic laws of the countries as WTO inconsistent, and India has also adversely faced the WTO rulings that we'll see in the form of 3 case studies. And it resorts to judicial lawmaking, as the panels are filling in the gaps in the trade rules that are not made in the WTO rules. Also, the appellate body has become dysfunctional. From 2019 till present, the US has been blocking the appointments of the judges for the appellate body. Therefore, the countries have been resorting to the ad hoc arbitration as an alternative mechanism because of the non-functioning of the appellate body. Also, there are institutional challenges as well in the current dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. For example, there are complex cases, whereas the workload of the WTO officials is high, and it leads to the delays in the dispute resolution. Also, there is a lack of transparency because the hearings, they are closed door hearings regarding the dispute settlement mechanisms, and there are bias risks also because most of the officials, they are coming from the developed countries, the Western countries, the developed economies. Now let's also observe a few case studies of the WTO disputes against India and what has India learned from them. First, there was the dispute regarding the agricultural products. In 2012, the USA challenged India's import bans because there were influenza concerns. Therefore, we banned the imports of poultry from USA. And the WTO panel, the independent expert panel, and also the appellate body both observed that there is no scientific basis against this import ban, and this is functioning as a trade restrictive ban. This ruling was against India. So what lesson did India learn? First, we revised our sanitary and phytosanitary measures so that they become WTO compliant, and we went for evidence-based trade policies, and therefore we revised our risk assessments to become WTO compliant. Another case study is related to the solar cells and solar modules. We imposed the domestic content requirements for the same. USA again challenged the domestic content requirement for the solar modules under the solar mission. It was alleged that it is violating the TRIMS and the national treatment rules. So what did India do? We shifted our focus to R&D, tax incentives, and to increase the competitiveness. Also, we tried to achieve a balance between trade and the environmental goals because we wanted to develop the solar energy industry in India itself, and therefore we went for the innovation driven policies over protectionism. Another case study is regarding the export subsidies. Again, it was US which challenged India's merchandise export from India scheme export subsidies. It was again alleged that India is violating WTO's SCM agreement. Therefore, India phased out the merchandise export from India scheme. Rather, we introduced the ROD tab, the rebate on the duties and taxes on the exported products, which is WTO compliant scheme. And therefore, we went for the tax or the duty refunds over the direct subsidies. So what are the suggestions that we can give for the reforms in the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO? First, there should be a pre-panel dispute resolution system also. Before the disputing parties approach for the constitution of the independent expert panels, rather there should be consultation mechanisms and pre-panel mandatory mediation and conciliation, and there can be non-binding arbitration also for sensitive sovereignty related issues. Regarding the appellate body and the panels, they can be strengthened. For example, permanent judges can be appointed in the appellate body so that there are no biases, because the judges, they are usually coming from the developed economies. Also, there can be transparency reforms. For example, the hearings, they should not be closed door hearings, rather open public hearings, except if it is containing some sensitive data or sensitive information of a country. And there can be exploration of the alternative enforcement mechanisms. For example, going for monetary compensation. If one party is not complying with the ruling, with the directive, then it has to compensate the other aggrieved party, and there can be fines imposed for the non-compliance, because going for monetary compensation or fines, it can be more effective rather than going for the retaliatory sanctions or the trade sanctions. Along with this, we need to ensure judicial independence. For example, the standing WTO court, that should have expert judges, but they should not be biased. They should be from a diverse background, and there should be clearer legal boundaries so that they are not infringing upon the domestic laws and thereby causing the sovereignty concerns for the developing nations especially. Now, coming to the article, it suggests that the WTO is facing its biggest crisis since its founding in 1995. The dispute settlement system, that is, it is effectively paralyzed because the appellate body appointments have been stalled for years, especially because of USA. And the WTO negotiations, they have struggled to keep pace with the major global shifts. For example, the digital commerce. Digital commerce is a rapidly growing sector, but it is also forming a large part of the cross-border economic activity, but the WTO rules have not evolved as such. With 166 members of the WTO, and they are all at very different levels of development, sometimes consensus is hard to reach. There are on top of it geopolitical tensions and also the growing use of tariffs such as political tools, and they have distorted the markets. So we should not look at these problems like the irrelevance of WTO, rather we should look at it positively, that the global trade, most of the global trade still operates under the WTO rules. Therefore, the emerging economies which now export the advanced and technology intensive products, climate related trade measures are expanding, digital networks are reshaping how the global production works. Accordingly, the WTO also has to evolve, reforms are needed, as the rules designed for the late 20th century trading system cannot fully govern the 21st century one. There is a means practice question also. Discuss the concerns regarding the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO. Suggest reforms to enhance its effectiveness. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the UN report on levels and trends in child mortality. This is important in prelims under the topic economic and social development, and also in GS2 under the topic health. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the steps taken by the government to reduce child mortality in India. First, under the National Rural Health Mission, the NRHM itself is a comprehensive program. There is the establishment of the newborn baby care corners at the child birth points, and the establishment of newborn stabilization units at the community health centers, and the special newborn care units at the district hospitals. Then under the ICDS scheme, the Integrated Child Development Services scheme, there is a focus upon the pregnant women, lactating mothers, and also the children from 0 to 6 years of age to improve both the health outcomes and the nutritional outcomes. There is the capacity building, that is training which is given to the healthcare service providers, the training given to doctors, ANMs, etc. under the integrated management of neonatal and child illness, and also the Navjat Sishu Suraksha Karyakram to focus upon the reduction of the child infection and child disease. Specifically for the tackling of malnutrition, there are several initiatives. For example, the establishment of nutritional rehabilitation centers. The focus is there upon the malnutrition because the malnutrition leads to the reduction in the resistance of the children against infection. Infection leads to disease, which leads to child mortality. And there is the launch of the MAA, Mother's Absolute Affection initiative as well, through which the optimal practices in the breastfeeding are promoted. For example, the initiation of breastfeeding within 1 hour, exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months after birth. There is the National Nutrition Mission also, through which comprehensive nutritional outcomes are targeted, and the National Iron Plus initiative, through which specifically the anemia in the children is targeted. There is the program home based newborn care as well, because about 57% of the child deaths are happening during the first 28 days after the birth itself. Therefore, through the ASHA workers, the home based newborn care is also promoted. And there is a universal immunization program again targeting the child mortality, through which 12 vaccine preventable diseases are targeted. 9 vaccines are given nationally. The nationally 9 diseases are targeted: the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, measles, rubella, hepatitis B, meningitis and pneumonia. And subnationally there is a targeting of 3 diseases, that is rotavirus diarrhea, pneumococcal pneumonia and Japanese encephalitis. And through the Matritva Sahyog Yojana, conditional maternity benefit is given, that is the pregnant women, they are incentivized. And there are several policy targets also. For example, the National Health Policy adopted in 2017 targeted for increasing the healthcare expenditure to about 2.5% of the GDP by 2025 and bringing down the neonatal mortality rate to less than 16 per 1000 live births and under 5 mortality rate to less than 23 per 1000 live births by 2025. There is the Sustainable Development Goal 3.2 also, which provides that by 2030 we will be ending the preventable deaths of the newborn and of less than 5 years children, and neonatal mortality needs to be brought down to less than 12 per 1000 live births and under 5 mortality to less than 25 per 1000 live births globally for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now coming to the UN report, the trends in the child mortality rate, we can see that the major causes for the child mortality, the under 5 deaths across the globe have been the prematurity followed by lower respiratory inspections. And the child mortality rates and the neonatal mortality rates both have been decreasing over the past 3 decades. Now coming to the article, about 4.9 million children have died before their 5th birthday in 2024 worldwide, including 2.3 million newborns themselves. Most of these deaths were preventable with proven low-cost interventions which, if taken up, their lives could have been saved and the access to quality healthcare was denied. The report titled Levels and Trends in the Child Mortality has observed that under 5 deaths globally have fallen by more than half since 2000. In the past 25 years, they have been reduced by more than 50%. However, since 2015, this pace has slowed by more than 60%. But India is the bright spot in this trajectory. India has demonstrated the steady progress in reducing the child mortality rate. In 1990, India had a neonatal mortality rate of 57 per 1000 live births, which fell to 17 neonatal mortality in 2024 per 1000 live births. Also, under 5 mortality rate witnessed a sharp fall. In 1990, it was at 127 per 1000 live births, and in 2024, it declined to just 27. This sharp reduction is due to targeted public health interventions, improved institutional deliveries, and expanded immunization coverage. These are the 3 chief focus areas of the government as well. Now, infectious diseases and injuries, they remain the leading cause among the younger children, while the self-harm is the leading cause among the girls aged 15 to 19 and the road traffic injuries among the boys. This year's report for the first time has also estimated the deaths directly caused by severe acute malnutrition. The report points out that more than 1 lakh children aged from 1 to 59 months or 5% have died from it in 2024, and malnutrition weakens the immunity of the children and therefore increasing their chances of mortality. The newborn deaths account for nearly half of all under 5 deaths. Leading causes of newborn deaths were complications from the preterm birth and complications during the labor and delivery. Beyond the first month, infectious diseases including malaria, diarrhea and pneumonia were the major killers, and malaria remains the single largest killer in this age group, accounting for about 17% of the child deaths. The next article is related to the NATO, why the NATO countries do not have to join the US-Israel war against Iran. This is important in prelims under the topic current events of national and international importance. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding NATO as well. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in 1949. Through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Washington Treaty to counter the Soviet expansion in the post-World War II Europe. The headquarters of NATO is located in Belgium, in Brussels, and it is functioning as a military and political alliance of 32 countries from Europe and North America, and it functions on the principle of collective defense. The Article 5 of the NATO Charter provides that an attack on one NATO country will be considered as an attack on all the NATO countries, and it was invoked only once till now after the 9/11 attacks on USA. And the founding members of the NATO include Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, UK and USA. Now coming to the article, Trump has been giving calls to his allies, the NATO allies, to join the war against Iran. And his rhetoric was there at the Davos also, where he said that US has not gotten anything out of NATO till now. Now, what does the NATO Charter say? Under Article 1 of the Charter, the members must commit to resolve any international dispute they are involved in through peaceful means without endangering the international peace, security and justice. They are also expected to refrain from using threats or force which is inconsistent with the principles of the United Nations. But what US has done, the present conflict, it is a clear rejection of this practice. Even the use of Article 5, which obligates the response by all the members if any one country is under attack, that may be invoked strictly as a defense measure. But US and Israel, they are going for the offensive. It was not a defense measure. It was not a retaliatory strike, rather it was a preemptive strike. So post 9/11, the other NATO allies, they were not obligated technically to join the US offensive in Afghanistan, but they opted to join a coalition of the willing formed by the USA, and geography is another limiting factor. Under Article 6 of the NATO Charter, the alliance's collective defense obligations, they apply only to specific regions. The regions including the territories of the member states in Europe and North America, Turkey and the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer, including their forces and vessels in the Mediterranean region. Whereas the current conflict which is playing out in Iran, that is beyond these geographical boundaries. Given these caveats, therefore, we can say that NATO has a high bar for a military response. Therefore, the allies, they have been responding individually on their own discretion. They have been going for an enabling support, such as giving logistics and the missile defense without invoking the Article 5 of the NATO Charter, and they have chosen to engage at their own discretion. For example, the UK has allowed the US to use some of its military bases in Cyprus following the suspected Iranian drone attacks on Cyprus. The Greece has sent frigates and F-16s, whereas the France has deployed the frigate Lengua to Cyprus, and the NATO forces, they have also intercepted the Iranian drones and missiles near the Turkey's Incirlik air base as well. And to date, before 2006 onwards, each member has been expected to contribute at least 2% of its GDP on its defense, and since 2014 endeavor to move towards 2% guideline within a decade. But according to the NATO data, the US defense spending constituted about 63% of the total defense spending in 2024, and that is also down from even higher number of 72% in 2016. And the US ranks 6th in terms of the percentage of the GDP spent on the defense. So Article 5 has been invoked only once for America's aid following the terrorist attack on September 11 in the USA. But now the NATO Charter Article 5 has not been invoked. The NATO allies at that time, they had come together in supporting USA in staging a military intervention in Afghanistan, and they burnt their fingers there. The next article is related to Bhavya scheme, the Bharat Audyogik Vikas Yojana. This is important in prelims under the topic economic and social development. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the Bhavya scheme. Under this scheme, 33,660 crores have been allocated for establishing the industrial parks in India. 100 plug-and-play industrial parks will be created in India to accelerate the industrial growth and the job creation across India. What are the key features under this? There will be the provision of pre-approved land and ready infrastructure for the establishment of the industrial park, and therefore it will be like a plug and play industrial ecosystem. There will be provision for the single window clearances, therefore providing for deregulation, and financial support will be provided from the side of the government up to 1 crore rupees per 1 acre establishment of the industries, and the industrial parks will be from 100 acres to 1000 acres across all the states as well as the union territories. The focus areas will be provision for the core infrastructure, that is provisions for the good roads, utilities, ICT systems, information communication and technology, and the value added infrastructure, for example establishment of the factory sheds as well as warehousing, and also construction of the social infrastructure for the housing of the workers and provision of social amenities as well. So who will be the beneficiaries of the Bhavya scheme? The primary beneficiaries will be the manufacturing units, the micro, small and medium enterprises, as well as the global investors also. The secondary beneficiaries will include the workers, the logistics firms as well as the local communities, as there will be the employment generation and the infrastructure generation and economic growth and development in general. Therefore, it will help in the job creation and also driving investments in the manufacturing sector, especially in India. So it will be focusing upon the ease of doing business and the deregulation, therefore going for the single window clearances and streamlined approvals. Along with this, it will go for the investor friendly reforms which will be led by the states, because the incentives will be provided by the central government and it is aligned with the Prime Minister Gati Shakti principles, thereby promoting the multimodal connectivity as well. And hence this cluster based development and co-location of the industries, suppliers and the service providers will lead to the strengthening of the domestic supply chains, which will lead to the promotion of the regional industrialization and hence ultimately leading to both employment creation as well as an Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now coming to the article, the Bhavya scheme is expected to generate large scale employment and creating direct and indirect job opportunities across manufacturing, logistics and services while attracting substantial investments as well. It will be implemented across all states and union territories. These parks will have core infrastructure like internal roads, underground utilities, drainage, common treatment facilities, ICT and administrative systems, and there will be the building of ready-made factory sheds built to suit units, testing labs, warehousing, etc. Along with this, there will be support provided for external infrastructure as well, which will be up to 25% of the project cost, while the project selection will be done through a challenge mode. Therefore, it will ensure that only high quality investment ready proposals are taken forward. The bids will be submitted, then they will be evaluated from the investors and it will be decided on the basis of a challenge mode, and it will be building upon the success of the industrial smart cities developed under the National Industrial Corridor Development Program. And therefore it will be implemented in partnership with the states and private players. With the pre-approved land and ready infrastructure and integrated services, it will reduce therefore the entry barriers for the investors and hence contributing to the generation of world-class greenfield industrial smart cities to enhance manufacturing competitiveness, attracting investments and generation of employment. The next article is related to the Parliamentary Standing Committee report on the PM Poshan. This is important in prelims under the topic economic and social development. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the Poshan Abhiyan. There are comprehensive interventions taken up by the government. For example, at the pre-pregnancy phase, there is the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, birth spacing advice, pregnancy care, etc. During pregnancy, there is antenatal care which is provided. There are immunization services, and upon birth, there is facility-based newborn care, ensuring the institutional deliveries, also the home-based newborn care which is provided, and the integrated management of the neonatal and childhood illnesses, and also several initiatives taken up to ensure the nutrition outcomes are also up to the targets. Additionally, under the Poshan Abhiyan specifically promoted through a Jan Andolan, there is focus upon the diet of pregnant women, calcium supplementation, institutional delivery, optimal breastfeeding, complementary food and feeding, full immunization and vitamin A supplementation, the growth monitoring and promotion, anemia prevention in the children, adolescent girls, food fortification, micronutrients, and also hygiene, sanitation, as well as the early childhood care and education, which are provided by the government. There are other initiatives also, for example, establishment of Poshan Vatikas. This is led by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, and it aims at promoting the Nutri Gardens at the Anganwadi centers, and about 1 lakh medicinal and fruit plants were planted in 5 different states during the Poshan Pakhwada 2021 by the National Medicinal Plants Board, the Ministry of Ayush, and it aims to promote the healthy dietary practices, promoting the importance of millets, sensitization activities on the Poshtik Aadhar, etc., and therefore it aims to improve the nutritional outcomes among women and children. There is the celebration of Poshan Ma also, the flagship program to improve the nutritional status again of women and pregnant women, to reduce the stunting, low birth weight and anemia among the children of less than 5 years of age, and to improve nutrition among children up to 6 years, adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women. Therefore, focusing upon food and nutrition, immunization, deworming, supplying of the oral rehydration salts and adolescent nutrition. Now coming to the article, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Education has recommended that Education Ministry should introduce at least a light breakfast in the midday meal scheme, now the PM Poshan scheme in the schools, and this scheme should be extended to cover all the students up to class 10 and then to class 12 also in the next 5 years, because a cooked meal is provided to the government school students and the aided school students up to class 8. The sudden stoppage of nutritional meals to the students after class 8, when most of them are reaching adolescence, is likely like a sudden turning off of the tap before the bucket is filled completely. Therefore, the adolescence, which is a critical growth phase, needs proper nutrition, and proper nutrition during these years will go a long way in preventing a large number of long-term health issues, thereby reducing the dropouts, particularly the dropouts among the girls. And there is a need to integrate the education with nutrition beyond class 8 also, particularly since class 10 and class 12 students, they prepare for the board exams which demand higher focus and cognitive performance. The next article is related to guillotine. This is important in prelims under the topic Indian polity and governance, the constitutional aspects. So let's discuss the types of motions which can be introduced in the parliament. First, there is the substantive motion. The substantive motions are independent motions. They are containing self-contained proposals, and therefore they are for the addressing of significant issues. For example, removal of the chief election commissioner, like the impeachment of the president. Then there are substitute motions. The substitute motions are introduced as an alternative to the original motion. If the substitute motion is adopted, then it will end up replacing the original motion. Then there are subsidiary motions. The subsidiary motions on their own, they lack any meaning. Rather, the House's decision cannot be determined without a reference to the original motion. There are 3 types of subsidiary motions. First, there is the ancillary motion. The ancillary motions, they are used as the standard procedure for handling different types of business, that this bill be passed or that this bill be put to vote. That is an ancillary motion. Then there are superseding motions, which are usually introduced by a member during a debate on another issue to override the earlier motion. And then there are amendment motions. The amendment motions are to modify or replace only a specific part of the original motion. It does not replace the original motion altogether. Then there are closure motions. The closure motions are introduced to end the debate on a matter that this has already been debated enough. Now this matter should be put to a vote. The closures again are of 4 kinds. First, there is the simple closure. That is, the member introduces the simple closure motion proposing that the matter has been sufficiently discussed, now it should be put to a vote. Then there is the closure by compartments, whereby the clauses of a bill or a lengthy resolution, it is divided into sections before the debate begins, and the entire section once debated, it is put to a vote. Then there is the kangaroo closure. The kangaroo closure, in this only the key clauses of a bill or the resolution are debated and they are voted upon. The other clauses, they are bypassed and they are deemed to be passed. Then there is guillotine closure. The guillotine closure is usually adopted when there is time constraint. Already the time allocated for the debate on that bill has passed and the remaining clauses, even if undiscussed, they are put to a vote along with the discussed clauses, that is the guillotine closure. Thank you.